Let's finish up our story of the war in the Middle Colonies by looking at two stories today. We've already seen part of the war in the Middle Colonies where the Americans have been overrun at Long Island. Very embarrassing. We lose New York City. The British have invaded in towards Philadelphia, and well, we've lost Philadelphia. We've lost so much, but things are going to turn around a bit today. At least we did have some success earlier in the Middle Colonies when George Washington, in a very daring raid, crossed the Delaware River on Christmas Day, 1776, and scored some victories at Trenton and Princeton. But a lot of things have gone on since then. That was January of 1777. And now we're in the fall, and well, a lot of things have not gone well for the Americans in the meantime. In fact, there are plenty of people starting to think that we should just give this up. Well, we'll see the story about how things are going to turn around. So today's LEQ, remember, is how did the American Army perform in the Middle Colonies? And by the end of this lesson, you should be able to answer that question really well, proving to me that you have learned something new today, using a complete sentence, at least 20 words, describing your knowledge that you've gained. Our first story is about the Battle of Saratoga. In some ways, this is a story about how the British commanders are just not very good. We've talked about with our advantages and disadvantages that the Americans have better commanders. Well, here's an example of why the British commanders just aren't that good. Here are three British generals involved in the story. Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne is on the left. He's the one who's actually going to do things pretty well here. William Howe in the center is supposed to be the mastermind of a plan to make three British armies meet in central New York and defeat the American army. Barry St. Leger is the general on the right. He's not going to do a very good job here at all. Three American generals involved. Horatio Gates. He's going to be the hero here, and he really wants to replace George Washington. In the center is Benedict Arnold. He's winning a lot of battles. Unfortunately, he's losing body parts, injuries and whatever. And on the right, there's George Washington. Some things just haven't been going well for George Washington. He's lost New York City, he's lost Philadelphia, and many people are starting to grumble that he's not doing a very good job. Well, the story is, I'll go back to this picture, the three British armies, one under Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, one under General Howe, and one under Barry St. Leger, are all supposed to meet in central New York because that's where the American army under Horatio Gates is stationed. Well, that American army and Benedict Arnold are not far away from each other. General Howe thinks, all right, let's get these three armies together, move them to central New York, destroy the American army, and the revolution will pretty much be over. Well, General Burgoyne starts to march south like he's been ordered to. He goes to Fort Ty. He recaptures that for the British. Of course, he has to leave some of his soldiers there, and he moves on to Albany. General Barry St. Leger starts to march his men down from Montreal. They come west, or from the west to the east towards Albany. But Benedict Arnold's army comes out and surprise attacks him, and Barry St. Leger loses and decides, I'm going back to Fort Oswego where I came from. I'm not going to be able to get to Albany. But Barry St. Leger doesn't tell the other two generals, Burgoyne and General Howe, that he's not coming. General Howe down here decides, hey, look, these other two armies don't really need me in Albany. I'm going to pack up my army in boats. We're going to sail our way down into the Chesapeake Bay, back up into what's now called Elkton, Maryland, and launch an attack on Philadelphia. General Howe doesn't tell Burgoyne or St. Leger he's not coming. So that means of three armies that are supposed to meet in central New York, Barry St. Leger's army is not coming. General Howe's army is not coming. General Burgoyne has had to leave part of his army at Fort Ty, now that he's recaptured it. So he's the only British general who's going to arrive. So things don't go very well for the British. General Burgoyne gets surrounded by American forces under General Gates and Benedict Arnold, General Arnold. Burgoyne decides to wait it out, hoping these other armies are going to come, because remember, he doesn't know they're not going to show up. Finally, Burgoyne is stuck. He realizes he's not going to get any help from anybody. He's going to have to try to fight his way out. It doesn't work. Big win for the Americans at Saratoga. Big win. So big, in fact, that General Burgoyne has to surrender in an embarrassing loss. So here's General Burgoyne. This painting is located in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, D.C. It's such a big turning point in the war. Saratoga is huge for us. The Americans win. Huge turning point because now the French are going to join our side. We have wanted them to join us for quite some time, and now they're going to actually do that. And the war in the Middle Colonies is pretty much over. Here's kind of a weird story that involves York, Pennsylvania. A lot of General Burgoyne's soldiers who were captured were taken prisoner. They were taken to a prison camp known as Camp Security in York, Pennsylvania. This big open area in the image here shows where Camp Security is. And today it's still, even though it's not that far from the Galleria Mall in York, but it's still not developed. There are not houses there. There's not a park, not really anything. Some farmland that still exists, even though there are housing developments all around it. The Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission and some other organizations have sponsored archaeological digs. They found a lot of remains of not soldiers, but of their equipment and of the camp. Kind of an interesting thing is a lot of those soldiers were Hessians. They spoke German. Pretty much everybody in York County spoke German at that time as well, it seems. And a lot of those soldiers just decided to stay after the war was over and they were released. Well, they weren't going to go back home. They actually, if they had families, could bring their families here, and these folks just stayed right here in York County, which was very much like home to them because everybody spoke German, newspapers were printed in German, church services conducted in German, schools were taught in German here in York County. And so these German soldiers kind of felt like it was the better option for them to stay here than to go home. The Treaty of Alliance is signed between the French and the Americans, and that means the French will fight against their old enemy, the British, join the Americans. The British take over Philadelphia, unfortunately. General William Howe, who didn't go to Albany, New York, does go to Philadelphia. The house in the center of the picture here is the house President Washington used as his residence when the U.S. Capitol was located in Philadelphia later. Some of you may read a book, Fever 1793, as our trade book later, and the president and his presence in Philadelphia is a big part of the story. Continental Army, though, moves to Valley Forge. They're kicked out of Philadelphia. They're going to go to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania for a miserable winter. Congress goes on to Reading, Lancaster, and York. By the way, there's Hanover. Harrisburg today is our state capital. So just kind of watch how this goes. There's a Susquehanna River appearing. There we go. The British Army takes Philadelphia. The Congress flees to Reading, Pennsylvania, and the Army goes to Valley Forge to be kind of a buffer between the British and the Congress. The Congress decides Reading is not good enough. They move to Lancaster, but that's where the Pennsylvania state government is meeting. There's just not room for both. So the Congress goes across the Susquehanna River to York for the winter of 1777 to 78. Now, the Army at Valley Forge has a really tough winter. You can go to Valley Forge today and visit the place where the Army had stayed. George Washington spent the winter at Valley Forge. There's the George Washington flag with those 7 pointed stars. That's at his headquarters. The paragraph on the left over here explains what George Washington wants his soldiers to build for themselves. You can still go see replicas of those cabins today. There's one at Valley Forge, made mostly of wood. Even the chimney is made of wood, which may not sound like a great idea. These are some replicas under construction, but Valley Forge is a terrible winter. The American Army just doesn't have enough food or clothing. They don't even have doors on those cabins for a while. Constant wind blowing, freezing temperatures, but then it warms up, and then it freezes again, and then it warms up. But oddly enough, as bad as it is, even with men starving, The American Army is better when they leave Valley Forge than when they arrive, because help from the French begins to slowly arrive throughout the winter, and some foreign leaders come, like the Marquis de Lafayette and the Comte Jean de Rochambeau, who maybe is where we get the rock, paper, scissors, Rochambeau from. Baron von Steuben is a German speaking Prussian who helps train the American Army, trains leaders who then train other groups, and the American Army winds up being much better when they leave. Thaddeus Kosciuszko is part of training the American Army and making them much better than they were. Lafayette Park, right across the street from the White House, is named for the Marquis de Lafayette. And on the four corners of the park are statues to these four leaders. So the White House will be right down here. The president can look out his front windows, see, well, Andrew Jackson in the center of the park, but see these four important foreign leaders who came to help us win our revolution. So the army's at Valley Forge. It's a tough winter. George Washington does have a headquarters there. He felt like he ought to be out with his men and not in a headquarters a lot. Now, unfortunately, Valley Forge has quite a problem with deer. There have been 241 deer per square mile about 10 years ago. The goal was to have it down to 35 per square mile by October of 2014. Well, they've pretty much made that goal, and, well, they've tried to get rid of the deer, and you might say, oh, that's horrible. Well, part of the problem here at Valley Forge is all this green stuff is the park. On one side is the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Right over here is the big King of Prussia Mall. There's big highways and housing developments. So the deer don't really have anywhere to go, and they don't have any enemies or predators, and no one's allowed to hunt in the park. So the deer have just multiplied and multiplied to the point where they're running out on the roads. They have chronic wasting disease. It's pretty bad. So the government has been working on reducing the deer herd, and it's been pretty successful, even if a little sad. Congress goes to York, Pennsylvania. There's the Colonial Courthouse in York, the building they met in. The building has been moved. It's not in the same place as it was when Congress met there. Horatio Gates wants George Washington fired by Congress. Horatio Gates tries to convince Congress. In fact, at this house, which is still in downtown York, you can go see it. Some people who want George Washington out and Horatio Gates in as commander meet at this house. They're about to propose that idea to some members of Congress. Just as they do, the Marquis de Lafayette, Frenchman, who is a friend of George Washington, is also at this meeting. He stands and proposes a toast to George Washington because the French people love George Washington. Well, that means this idea of replacing him is going to go nowhere. Today, there's a statue out in front of the Gates house of the Marquis de Lafayette raising his wine glass in a toast to George Washington, which may well have saved his job. Ironically enough, just after this statue was installed, like on a Thursday, they had a dedication ceremony. The following Saturday, a drunk driver wiped it out. So kind of ironic, a man raising a toast is hit by a drunk driver. So there's the Marquis de Lafayette proposing his toast. We have quite a Revolutionary War theme in York today. That we believe York was the first capital of the United States, first time we called ourselves the United States, the first time members of Congress have come up with a plan about what to do when the Americans win the war. A lot of businesses called First Capital something or other, or York Federal. We even have a baseball team called the York Revolution. Very proud of our Revolutionary War history in York. The next spring, the British leave Philadelphia to go back to New York City. That's a big disaster for them because they decide to go by land. They get destroyed at a thing called the Battle of Monmouth. And, well, maybe a lady by the name of Molly Pitcher becomes kind of famous. The Articles of Confederation is our first attempt at a government. We'll learn more about that later. And here's to you, Mr. Clark. A job well done. The middle colony version of the war, period of the war, pretty much comes to an end after Saratoga. And even though the American Army is doing very badly at Valley Forge, they do wind up becoming better by the time they leave, and the British wind up being kicked out of the middle colonies.